Hey, podcast listeners. Tired of ads barging into your favorite news podcasts? Good news. With Amazon Music, you have access to the largest catalog of ad-free top podcasts included with your Prime membership. Stay up to date on everything newsworthy by downloading the Amazon Music app for free or go to amazon.com/ad-free news. That's amazon.com/ad-free news to catch up on the latest episodes without the ads.
Hello and welcome to The Price of Music, the show that looks at the money behind the music industry with me, Steve Lamack, and Music Allies Head of Insight, Stuart Dredge. We have some guests joining us for this episode, Stuart, because it's National Album Day on October the 19th, this coming Saturday, marking the importance of the LP. So we spoke to a couple of people who are champions of the album. Give us a bit of background about the people who we're talking to this week.
Yeah, so we're talking to Jonathan Green, who's managing director of EarMUSIC, MPS Records in stereo, but he's also one of the founders of National Album Day when it first happened. And also Megan Page, who's head of PR, marketing and promotions at ERA. So that's like the Entertainment Retailers Association. It's one of the two bodies that are behind National Album Day, together with the BPI. But she's also the organiser of Record Store Day UK as well. So she's kind of on top of both these big moments in the music calendar.
Jonathan and Megan, welcome to The Price of Music. You are, of course, amongst friends here because a lot of our listeners hold the concept of the album in very high esteem. So, I mean, we should start with some history, I guess, really, because this is what's the 7th National Album Day. So how did it start? Why did it start? Who had the idea and who made it happen? There you go, 4 questions in one. Anyone can go first.
Guilty as charged. I mean, the original idea I'd had in my mind for a long time because I always looked at World Book Day and how the publishing industry had really got behind that, and that had really been something that had become a cultural phenomenon. And I was invited to a BPI Indies special committee to discuss the future of physical product within the new era of streaming, and if we could think of any ideas which would be useful to help physical survive the kind of the streaming onslaught. So I thought, now's an idea that has found its time. So I pitched the idea of a National Album Day to the committee, which was chaired by indie legend Ian McNay, founder of Cherry Red Records. And he took that to the BPI's CEO, Jeff Taylor, who was initially very positive, discussed it with Kim Bailey, chairperson of ERA, who was also very positive, and it just really started to build around the industry. We had a lot of meetings to kind of bring it all together. The BBC coming on board was a very big part of us kind of getting a first year together, and really it's sort of grown and grown over the 7 years.
Yeah, and I mean, to add to that, I guess my background, I've been organising Record Store Day at that time for about 5 years. And I guess the format and the template is quite similar in a way, in which you bring the industry together under one umbrella to celebrate a shared cause or a shared format. And it lent itself quite nicely to the passion and the ethos that had come out of the BPI Independent Committee. And I think that there was a lot of goodwill in the industry. And I think it was at a time of real change. I think 7 years ago there was, streaming absolutely was and has been revolutionising the industry for a very long time, and it's given lots of people lots of different ways to listen to music. That's neither a good thing nor a bad thing. It just is what it is. And I think the whole idea of celebrating National Album Day is just however you choose to listen to your albums, how conveniently on streaming, at home, with a glass of wine like I do with my record player. It's just about championing, celebrating, and cherishing that experience of listening to something from start to finish. So we've really built it up from a real, I would say, a grassroots level into something which 7 years later has got the backing of BBC, which is absolutely amazing, the backing of the general wider industry, and it's one of the only events that happens in the calendar that happens across all retail, from your independent record shops to your Spotify's to your Amazons and beyond, really. So we're proud of where it started and where it is now.
And I mean, you both mentioned streaming, and is it fair to say that was what part of the concept? Because I remember when it started, there was quite a lot of people in the industry kind of going, oh, it's all about playlists now. The album, people like to predict things are going to die. Like, the album is dead. It's all about playlists now. Was that something that was in your head at the time? This idea of people saying albums aren't maybe the dominant mode of listening to music they used to be. It's all about kind of stuff being chopped up and put into different places now.
Absolutely. I mean, there was conversations being had in the industry about the album, had reached its end of life, and playlists were going to take over. And I would hear artists talk about this as like, why bother making an album anymore? Because nobody wants them. It's just for old people, and you don't make any money out of them. And I thought, wow, this is absolutely insane. The artists that I'm working with are still very motivated to make records. They see it as the primary way of expressing their art and their creativity as performers and songwriters, to suddenly go from making those lovely 15-minute songs in prog rock to trying to cut that down to 3 minutes and see if that can float the algorithm, was a very interesting thought that kind of set me thinking, well, hang on a second. It's a bit like saying you can now only write short stories, going to the great authors and saying, it's great that you've written this novel. Can you cut it down to about a 20th of the size and make it a little bit more snappy? And you're thinking, streaming is a wonderful thing. It's really helped save the industry in so many ways. But the album really still sits, I think, center of how most artists see their recorded music career. They look at it in terms of debut albums, sophomore albums, a career that can be mapped out in a series of record releases. And so having that recognized culturally felt like a really important moment, that if we didn't jump now, maybe we'd be too late. And I think, history has definitely proved it was the right thing to do. And I think now we exist in a world where streaming and physical product help each other. It really has been a very good symbiotic relationship where people, dig into the streaming version of a record, decide that is a great record, I want to own it, and then go and buy it. So I think we've now kind of passed the kind of panic of the new and into a new era where we very much feel, okay, this is something that's working. How can we grow everything?
So it's almost in a way you've already achieved some of the goals that you set for yourselves. Are you each year then? Are you now trying to think, well, what is our ambition for this year? What would we like to achieve? Because it's not just making people sit up and take notice of albums for a day or a week. Is it? It's not just about a spike in sales for 1 week. There's more to it than that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that we try and achieve is enabling people to discover albums that they've not necessarily listened to before. And every year we have a theme which allows us to really deep dive into a different part of the industry. And in the past, we've had themes such as the 90s or the 80s. We've had women in music. We've had debut albums. And this year we're celebrating Great British Roots. And it just really allows us to do, an extra special magnifying glass over what's going on in that particular decade or in that particular genre. And to just kind of analyse like the real rich cultural history that the UK has got with albums, that some albums, may have been overlooked, the first time round, and it's a really nice opportunity to revisit them and to open them up to a new audience. And I think that in a world, with streaming, with TikTok, reassessing, established artists and established music is something which is so much more feasible now, and it's so much more accessible. And I think having the different themes, having the different the different angles to talk about albums has really allowed us to go really in depth on some of those really interesting and exciting.
I do love that idea of listening to albums that you've never listened to in the past. We did this once on the Six Music show, and we're trying to encourage listeners to listen to records, classic records that they'd never listened to. And obviously it's a reciprocal thing, and the audience unanimously made me, or suggested to me, you, young man, at the weekend for the very first time will listen to Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd, which I have to say, I'm pleased I've listened to it. It's nice to have an opinion on it. I'm not necessarily sure I'll be listening to it again, but it was a great exercise, though. You're right, because it's just, it's the, because it brings out the inquisitiveness, I think, which is there, however deep it lies in music fans. But it does that, certainly, and that's a great idea.
There's like a whole genre, isn't there, on YouTube of reaction videos? I think it was a guy, is it like as a hardcore hip hop fan hearing Rage Against the Machine's first album for the first time, and he's sat in his car and he's just absolutely blown away by it. And it's a like wonderful, joyful video, I mean, how do you, without, I don't want to reduce it to metrics, but how do you measure the success of national? Like, do you have numbers you can talk about in terms of where you've seen growth in sales or conversation or some of the other things you're measuring? Like, how do you measure that success?
To be honest, we kind of see it first and foremost as a cultural event, which is actually quite hard to assess, what's the impact in terms of culture. And we kind of generally tend to review that as, the social impact, the press impact, the number of events that are happening around the country. Of course, we've got this fantastic partnership with BBC, which has, elevated it to a whole new audience and a whole new level. If you're going to deep dive into some of the kind of commercials, there are some really positive numbers coming out of National Album Day in terms of, we have a product list which we release every year, which revolves around the theme. There'll be about 40 or 50 different albums reissued or created especially for the day. They generally tend to populate the official charts. The top 40 every time we release them. Generally see about a 30% week-on-week uplift in vinyl, which is very positive. And also in terms of streaming, a lot of those albums that are in the product list enjoy, up to 90% uplift week on week in their streaming sales as well. So there are some positive commercial bonuses to the day and the activity and the conversations that are happening around the day. But most importantly for us, and I think Jonathan will agree, that it's about the cultural movement and the conversations and just, the impact that it has across kind of media, really.
I do think the idea of the album has definitely helped by National Album Day. And so I don't hear any artists saying, I don't want to record a new album because no one wants them now. You definitely find, especially young artists, very much talking up the idea of recording a debut album and how that is important. And so I think the cultural aspect, that has been a success, but it's also very much still growing. I think we are living in an era when it's been really tough for the creative arts. Funding is being cut across the board. And actually, National Album Day is a really good way to express, the enthusiasm the public have for musicians making music that can turn into careers that then show that those music lessons in school were a great idea. We all start somewhere, and cutting music funding in schools does have an effect down the line. So I think this is part of a wider conversation culturally that the UK is having right now.
We wanted to pick your brains, I think, on the evolution of the album, because some of the things we've been talking about on the show in previous weeks are the way albums are changing and mutating. So one thing we talked about is the way that variants are kind of seem to be on the rise, and like an album will come out and it's actually got, well, I say 17 different versions, it might be sort of 6, 7. It feels like 17 months. Is that something you're seeing in terms of how the album as a product is evolving? Like, it's not just one thing anymore. It can be many different formats, versions, depending on who's buying it and what they want.
Yeah, I definitely would say from a label perspective, this is very much driven by the artists. However they want to release a record is very important to how we then proceed with that project. Many artists record many more tracks than can be fitted onto a vinyl album or a double vinyl album. And so there are these kind of tracks that have a philosophical link to the main product, how do we get them out there? And I'm a big science fiction fan, and Philip K. Dick, the great visionary, he had this idea of worlds that could be created by creative minds, and the fans could then get into those worlds and inhabit the worlds of the creator. And that is a kind of, in a way, the metaverse, but in a smaller way, kind of multiple versions of the album, multiple formats. You're kind of getting involved in the creativity of the author. And I do think, therefore, this is something that's only going to grow as technology allows it to grow. Obviously, there are always restrictions on how you can do things, but digital really does help. Direct to consumer also will help. So I think as long as there's the appetite for people to want those formats, then the artists will continue to experiment and grow the ideas.
Yeah, and just to touch on that as well, I mean, I think we exist now in a very kind of delicate ecosystem in the music industry where there are lots of moving parts into how it works, and it always quite complementary of each other. And I think the different variants are created for those different fan bases. And you've got your independent retail exclusives, which might feed more into that kind of super fan, super collectible, one-off limited edition that will cater for that audience. And then you might have your more standard variant for someone who's more of a casual collector, who just wants it in their collection. And then there might be a special D2C version as well, where the artist wants to, like Jonathan said, experiment with, or a luxury edition to allow them to represent their music in some different ways. And so I think this is probably here to stay, because I think we all want to be able to cater for lots of different audiences in music, and for those music fans to really be able to feel like there's a real tangible connection and link to the artist that they love. And the album format is the most obvious way of doing that. And so I think if you can create special formats and special editions which really appeal to all of those different segments of your fan base, then like Jonathan said, I think it's only a good thing.
And it's interesting hearing you talk about artists having more music, because I think one of my favorite stories recently was when the Taylor Swift album came out. I think it came out at midnight, didn't it? And then at 2 a.m. she was like, oh, by the way, there's a second album as part of it. Here you go. And I think Coldplay have done I think yesterday Coldplay announced Moon Music Deluxe with 3 extra tracks. Like that, is that a trend we're seeing, that this idea of here's the album, it's 12 songs, that's it, versus well, here's the expanded version, here is the deluxe drop, that seems to come not like a year later or 2 years later, but a few days later. That seems quite interesting.
I mean, it's a good point. I mean, back in the day when I worked for Universal, we had the idea of how can we grow the CD format. So I suggested that we come up with a concept that was akin to hardback and softback books, with the standard CD being the softback, and then what we called special edition, which was like a deluxe CD, would have bonus tracks, because often the artists would record these extra tracks and then we didn't know quite what to do with them. It was like, oh, that's going to be a CD B-side. It always felt like a waste of some great tracks that just didn't quite fit in with the 12 or 15 track format. So then we thought, well, let's do these deluxe CDs, which were quite successful for quite a while. But then obviously download really took over and the concept kind of faded away. And I think what we're really seeing now is, like many things in the music business, a cyclical thing where an old idea has come back with a new twist to it. And I think most fans absolutely love the idea that their artists are so creative that they could bang out a couple of albums when many people are only doing one. And it does really, take you back to that early era when it wasn't unsurprising that albums by artists who were, really on a roll could even release 4 albums a year. I think certain artists in that kind of 70s album era, when it wasn't just necessarily about singles, you would find people able to be issuing 4 albums of quite varied sound. and the fans would just be happy to get what was coming their way, and kind of then they'd be able to discuss, how creative their favorites are. So I think it's a generally a positive trend for music lovers. I mean, sometimes it can be quite a lot to buy. If you're buying physical products, it is appreciated that there's a genuine cost, and we are living in a time when money is perhaps a little bit thin on the ground. But it is also really great when you do get these records and you're kind of wallowing in your favorite artist's creativity.
It's true, though, actually, even if you just go back to the punk and new wave era, the Jam would release 2 albums in a year, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
And we then went through, I think at the end of the noughties into the tens, where bands would disappear for 4 years on tour between making records. And that seemed too much for me. If you need 4 years to make it, I know you're traveling the globe and you're playing live to lots of people, but make us another record, because we don't know where you're up to, or have you hit some creative block, or is it just impossible to write songs in a van? I don't know. The one thing I did think about, particularly the timing this year, National Album Day, this new Coldplay record, which Stuart just mentioned, couldn't come at a better time, really, because if you needed evidence that the album is still a format enjoyed by a huge swathe of music fans, then it's this Coldplay record, isn't it? Which I think the stat was, after it had sold 160,000 album units in 72 hours. So it's the biggest British album of the year by a mile. But it does sort of endorse, doesn't it, the fact that if there's a record that people want, the album, it's as alive as you want it to be.
It totally speaks to the fact that we are, in a world now where artists are absolutely prioritizing their albums as part of their marketing campaigns. And there seems to be less of the kind of drip feeding of singles and playlisting, and actually really prioritizing the dropping of an album and a big moment surrounding an album. And we can see that in the trends in album sales. In fact, this year we're up about 10% year on year in terms of album sales. And I think it helps to have these great, heavyweight artists that have got these bigger heavyweight albums out. But actually, I really think it's because all artists across the spectrum are just really prioritizing the album once again, and the whole facet of the album in terms of, the artwork and the liner notes and all of those different versions that they create a part of that really drive and feed into that super fandom, super collectibleness. And I think it's resulted in a really healthy albums market that's kind of really driving revenues for the music industry. So yeah,
I tell you what's also interesting as well is how the resurgence of the album has, in some cases, revived certain bands' careers as well. You have Shed 7 at number 1 in the album chart a couple of weeks ago, but there's an audience obviously still there who have rediscovered their love of the album, which they had in their youth, I think back in the 90s, or in some cases the noughties. But there's 90s bands all over the place making new records now that seem to be incredibly popular, and it's done their careers no harm at all, I think. Have you noticed that?
I was going to say, what's been fun is how the media have been telling everybody that guitar music is dead and bands are dead. And then the last few weeks, we've had nothing but bands, guitar bands, and number 1 records from artists who have proved them wrong. Coldplay's sales this week are incredible. Shed 7, who are working with us on National Album Day as champions, had 2 number 1 albums this year, which is unbelievable. From an EarMUSIC perspective, we've had The come back after 25 years away and had an enormous success globally, which just goes to show you, the imprint you make as an album's artist, it doesn't go away. You make those great records, they do stand the test of time, and there is a market still there. So you have to kind of obviously do the campaign right, make sure everything is planned and executed well, but then the public is waiting for it. So I think that's what's really exciting.
Mm-hmm. I mean, when we started this podcast, saying Shed 7 having 2 number one albums this year wasn't on my list of predictions. With no disrespect to the band, but, they've done a really good job, haven't they? I mean, I wanted to ask you, if I can put my grumpy old man talking rubbish hat on for a minute again. There is a kind of view that people think, right, streaming killed off listening to albums, and now TikTok is killing off listening to full songs, and the kids just listen to 30 seconds and skip on. But I sense there's more to it than that. That like some of the younger people, Generation Z, actually they're buying vinyl, they're listening to albums too. It's not like everyone young has got rid of this old long playing format. But what are you seeing, and how are you feeling about how younger music listeners respond to albums?
Yeah, I mean, I think the industry likes to be really negative, doesn't it? In terms of, writing off formats, this is dead, that is dead. And actually, when you dig into some of the research and some of the data and some of the things that we're seeing is that, streaming is driving those physical sales. TikTok is driving those physical sales. It feeds into this idea of that super fan buzzword, which is, always being kind of thrown around at the moment. But actually, the idea of the super fan has been around for quite some time, and Era did some research into it about 3 years ago. And I think, streaming is absolutely mass market. TikTok is mass market, and it appeals to, such a broad audience. But what it allows is those super fans to dig deep and to dive into the world of physical and collectible. And albums are the only real format that allow you to do that, because there's this whole idea around achievement and accomplishment, which as a super fan, you want to be in that top 1% of listeners on Spotify that's listened to that album the most times. You want to be the first person in line on a record store day queue when, the super special limited edition variant has come out. And to be honest, without, your TikToks of this world, without your kind of YouTubes and streaming services, that just wouldn't really exist. So I think we need to take quite a realistic view of the world, and that, it is complementary, and maybe, it's taken us a little bit of time to realize it, or it's taken us a little bit of time to get there. But I think, like Jonathan said at the start, I think we're in a really healthy place, a really healthy ecosystem where, young people are being, from everything that we see, are being turned on to the album and to physical music via, these digital innovative tech platforms. So yeah, less negativity. I think we should be more positive about where the album's going and who's listening.
Yeah, and not underestimate younger people. I think that's a very easy thing to do. Is say they've all got no attention span, doing blah blah, but actually it's often more complicated, isn't it, when you dig into what they're actually doing? I mean,
Definitely.
You mentioned streaming services. I mean, it'd be good to talk about what they're doing around National Album Day, because, like you were saying, they've bought into it. They're doing stuff. It's not just about stores. So how are they supporting it this year? What kind of things are they doing?
Yeah, so I mean, the way they get involved tends to vary per platform, but it will be things like editorial content around our album champions and helping us to deep dive into some of those stories behind the release of an album. They'll create some very interesting social media content with artists, go through their inspirations and what the album means to them as an artist as well. Sometimes themed playlists, a playlist does help drive people to an album. You could have a playlist of, the best album openers of all time, or, the best album closers of all time, or however you might want to theme that. And just generally being supported in terms of, carrying the branding, helping us with news generation, and just really creating a moment on their platforms around that weekend. So yeah, there's lots for them to get stuck into, and they do a really good job of it.
Is it fair to say things have improved? Because I remember probably around the time National Album Day launched, I remember feeling quite frustrated that the streaming services used to be showing me lots of playlists and lots of stuff with tracks. And it was quite hard in a way to find new albums or bands I liked, because they weren't really kind of putting them in front of me. But in the last 5 years, I feel like they're doing more of that. There's pop-ups saying this new album's out. There's listening parties. They're doing stuff around. Like, has that been one of the trends since? I mean, you could take credit for it if you like, but has that been one of the trends since you launched that the streaming services have actually gone, you know what, albums are something we want to get behind. It's not just about tracks and playlists. Has there been movement that way?
I mean, I think retailers and digital services respond to what their customers seemingly want and ask for. And I think if it's a response to having more demand for album listening, more long-form listening, and artists presenting their music as a body of work that they want to be listened to from start to finish, then I think it's only natural that the DSPs will reflect that on their services. And so I think that, there's one element is responding to the demands, and there's other elements, innovation in technology, which has just allowed services to super serve more bespoke content and music to fans, and to super service fans. I mean, I know from my perspective, the albums that I get served up on my streaming services now are always absolutely spot on. And I think, how did I not, know about this before? And they've completely got my music taste down to a T. So I think it's using those kind of AI, generated algorithms in some ways to help people discover more, but also just being responsive to the market demands, really.
I almost feel like...
Do you know what I think? Sorry, Stuart. Do you know the one thing that streaming services could do to actually recreate how exciting an album, an original vinyl album is that there's a break halfway through where you have to get up and click. So to recreate the, when you had to get out of your chair, turn the album over, and then put the needle down again. That's what they should do. Although there's just very quickly, there's this kind of serious point there in the evolution of the album, isn't there? As we move to CDs, as you were alluding to, Jonathan, the album, you could do so much on a CD, more possibly than you could do unless you were doing a double vinyl album. So you could do loads, but it meant that albums started getting longer. And also the track listing of it became more and more complicated because they didn't have that, the touchstone of side 2, track 1. So you would track list an album in 6 tracks or 7 tracks on the first side, and then 6 or 7 tracks on the second side. And so there would be almost 2 narratives in some cases. With the CD, people were getting to about track 7 or 8 and they didn't know where they were going after that. So the actual format can affect the creatives and the way they work. And I think we've seen, particularly with somebody like the Arctic Monkeys' recent albums, that actually it sounds like they made it as an album. They made 6 tracks, and then the record so it reaches one climax after track 5 or 6 and starts again. So, as you say, it's cyclical, but it's interesting how the album format has influenced the music on the album.
In the mainstream, you really see that if you listen to a Taylor Swift album, they're meant to be listened to in their entirety as she intended, and I think that has really driven a narrative globally about albums, because obviously the success of those records and the success of the artist has made, if you're listening to 1989, you're listening to the whole thing from beginning to end. You're not skipping. And I think the fact that now exists in so many younger minds, that whole concern of everything, they're just going to listen to the singles, they're never going to go beyond track 3. I think a lot of those worries have dissipated thanks to the creativity of some incredible artists.
I was going to say, I think with someone like Drake, who releases like 30 plus tracks when a new album comes out, and it must give, the flippant answer is that's too much Drake if you don't like him. But I guess the creative challenge there is he's got to spin a narrative, hasn't he, over that to keep people listening. They can't just be track for 30 tracks. So you do have to start thinking about, like Steve was saying, what is the narrative of how people are listening to this, whether it's 30 tracks or 11. Mm-hmm. Megan, while we have you here, we kind of wanted to talk about Record Store Day as well, even though it's kind of off cycle in terms of what's happening about this month. But it feels like that's become a really important calendar moment as well, for album sales, but as well, obviously it's singles and EPs. But how has that growth been? Because it's, how many years has that been going now?
So it'll be in its 17th year.
Wow.
This year we celebrated 17 Record Store Days. So I've been at the helm of Record Store Day for about 10 years now, and I have to say 10 years ago when I started it was much smaller than it is now, and it's completely snowballed, particularly in the last kind of 6 or 7 years since we partnered with BBC Six Music, and it really amplified it to a whole new listenership of music lovers. Record shops are the home of the album. Ultimately, it's the place where you go to traditionally to discover new music, and it's a place that people still go. And I think that what Record Store Day has done is just put indie record shops back on the map. I think, pre-Record Store Day, again, those negative conversations, the vinyl was dead, the formats, nobody's interested in vinyl anymore. And actually it was the indie record shops that said, there's still an appetite for this, there's still a demand for this, and we're not catering to them properly. And it took Record Store Day to kind of put that on the map of executives at record labels, and to really highlight and showcase that there was still a huge appetite for vinyl and for physical music. And the things that we've noticed changing in the last few years, which for me is really exciting, is the whole new generation of young people coming out for Record Store Day. The queues are a big part of the day and a big part of the event. And, often it's kind of, maybe 50 plus dad at the front of the queue has been there for 12 hours. Actually, what we've seen the last kind of couple of years is that that's been taken over now with 16, 17-year-old girls who are queuing up because they want, either the Taylor Swift release or the 1975 or One Direction. And so I think that's just, it just shows us and illustrates and demonstrates what's going on in the rest of the industry as well. Really, Record Store Day is just about celebrating that culture of independent record shopping, getting people who have never bought a record before to go out and buy a record, enjoy the experience, and hopefully continue to do so for many years to come. So, yeah.
I remember seeing, it probably was about 17 years ago, there was this guy, he was a futurologist, and he would turn up at music industry conferences and say, music is like water. It's going to be everywhere. No one's going to buy music. It's all about access. And that's the interesting thing for me, that it's not just about formats being killed off prematurely, but the idea of buying and paying for music being killed off prematurely. It feels like there was a lot of talk around that with streaming, and that seems to be Record Store Day and other things too have hit home the fact that streaming and ownership / buying sit side by side. It's not a one or the other. But I guess that's something you've seen about. And what has Record Store Day taught you about why people want to buy and own music rather than just stream it?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a few things. I think in a world which is completely digital now, you listen to your phone for music and it's absolutely convenient and it serves a purpose and it allows you to listen to things you might never have listened to before. So there's a real reason for it. But actually, I think it's the experience, the active listening experience of listening to a vinyl record or a CD. It's the ritual, as Steve was saying, about turning it over halfway through, the kind of the crackle and the pop when the needle hits, the reading of the liner notes and the artwork. And I think that's something which in our world, which has become so digitally focused, has kind of, been forgotten and lost. And that's something which, digital services just can't offer. So I think it allows people to really connect with music in a completely different way. And it goes back to that, super fandom, collectible, feeling a real part of the artist world and the artist journey. And having that tangible, relationship to it. And I think that's what young people love. And I think we forget that they didn't grow up around vinyl. They didn't grow up even around CD, a lot of the people that we're seeing on Record Store Day. But the act of putting that record on and experiencing music in that, not in a passive way anymore, in a real active way, I think is something that brings a lot of people a real lot of joy. And I think that it can't be replicated. I think it's just, you can see I'm very passionate about it, and I'm sure a lot of music fans are.
I mean, I was going to just add to, what Megan said was the human element of the passion for physical product is really what's helped save it, because obviously digital is fantastic and it's all about convenience, but it doesn't cover all the senses. And there's a fantastic book, The Revenge of Analog by David Sachs, and it goes through all these things that were supposed to be extinct and have had massive revivals. So vinyl is the one that most people think of, and that's been something that's grown and grown. But then you think about the book industry, that was supposed to die when the Kindle arrived. Board games have had a huge resurgence. Why would you have a board game when you can get an Xbox? But in fact, young people love board games. So I think the idea of experience is very much what makes this work. It's great fun going to a record shop and going through the racks. It's a social experience as well as a musical experience. And I think owning a vinyl album, it does have that feeling of something that puts you above the person that just listened to on Spotify. If you've got that crystal vinyl version that's limited to 500, you can then, you've got bragging rights when it's seeing your friends and seeing other fans. Which one did you get? Whereas if you've just streamed something, that is great, but that is not really a bragging right if everybody has got it. And I think that is the difference between, the utility argument, which is, I think, very much a good thing. We all need water. We've all got water, but no one has a good chat about what kind of water did you have today. It doesn't have that kind of element of anything one-upmanship about it at all. So I think really what we're really discovering is things about humanity and what makes us human, and I think in an era where technological change is about to get much faster, these are things that we'll actually find hanging on to that is where the enjoyment aspect really lies.
Do you think it is that then, partly? I hadn't thought about this, but, it is a sociable experience. When I was growing up, friends would come round. You would be the only one who had a copy of the record, so people would come round and, to your house, and you sort of sit there just listening to the record or watching the thing go round. But it brought people together. That sort of, it was a way of... I don't know. It just seemed like friendships were built around this, and there was a social angle to the physical product. And as you say, there's the bragging rights as well as who's got the undertones. Jimmy on green vinyl and who didn't. Hands up, losers. But yeah, going back to your story about the queues and how the queues at Record Store Day are part of the experience. A few years ago, I put out a compilation album through Demon Records, the Lost Alternatives album, and it was launched around Record Store Day. And so we did a tour for Record Store Day. We started off at Sister Ray in London. Amazing. Then we went to Spillers in Cardiff, and then we ended up at Rough Trade in Bristol. But I do remember, so we started, it was very early on the Saturday morning, and we arrived at Spillers, and there's a massive queue already. I don't know how long the shop had been open, but Phil from Sister Ray came out because he's got a clipboard, and he's, obviously he's looking at the stock and what's left and what they've got. But he walked out and he just shouted down the queue, just to let everybody know, all the Bananaramas have gone. Three men at different parts of the queue just looked down at their feet and walked off. Bananarama's gone. We've still got China Crisis. And the other knock-on effect, before we talk a bit about this year, is Record Store Day and National Album Day. Between them, I mean, I think, bringing everyone together around the album is an amazing thing. But do you think practically, certainly Record Store Day has helped this resurgence in vinyl, which then has meant we've had to start opening pressing plants again? There were basically no pressing plants left in the UK, were there at all? And now people are having to open up pressing plants because the demand has returned. And it's weird, isn't it? The album, as you say, which once written off, is now having knock-on effects all over the place.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think when Record Store Day started, I think only about 75,000 vinyl albums had been sold in the UK. Last year we sold 6.5 million. So in that, space of time, you can just see how it's, how it's grown. And I think that the manufacturing industry found it really difficult to keep up with that demand, because for so long, everyone kept saying, this is a fad. This is going to be, a short thing which people are going to kind of get bored of. It's a trend which is going to die out. It's just retro and kitsch, and the youngsters are going to move on to something else in the next couple of years. But the appetite has just not changed. If anything, it's just kept on growing and growing and growing. And I think the manufacturing industry, it found it a challenge because it had closed down all of its plants. They were all mothballed. They didn't work. It was actually the knowledge of the staff that they didn't have anymore, because they hadn't had someone run these pressing plants for however many years. And so there was a bit of a time where we had a little bit of a bottleneck in the vinyl industry. We just absolutely couldn't catch up with the demand. But the good news now is that there's pressing plants opening up literally all around the world, and particularly in the UK, you've got Press On in Middlesbrough. From what I hear, there's about 2 or 3 new plants opening in Scotland, and that we've got, you know, far more capacity available now, so that artists can turn those albums around super quickly, can drop those albums in, you know, in creative and inventive ways, which allows them a lot more flexibility and creativity that we may not have had, you know, 4 or 5 years ago. So it's good news for the manufacturing industry as well, I think.
So this year's National Album Day, what's happening this year? You've mentioned Shed 7 are one of your champions this year. I was thinking when we were talking about getting up and turning the record over about my original vinyl version of Jeff Wayne's War of the Worlds, which is a story told in 4 sides, in 4 chapters, isn't it? 4 pieces of work. But Jeff Wayne is one of your champions as well. Who else is involved this year?
So yeah, we've got Jeff Wayne, we have Shed 7, Travis, Nova Twins, we've got Liam Frey from the Cortinas, record producer Catherine Marks, and Jazzy B from Soul to Soul. And so they kind of basically sum up, you know, all the different facets of the album world in terms of genres and creation. And really they help us kind of, you know, spearhead the campaign, telling their stories about why the album means so much to them, what the future of the album looks like. And they'll be participating in some events to be announced over the next coming weeks as well. So, yeah.
And to finish, Stuart wants to do his fortune teller bit again, don't you, Stuart? You've got a question about the future.
Always the future at the end, yeah. Well, I was kind of just wondering about tapping your brains about where you think the album might be in 10 years' time. With the knowledge that no one's going to come back and listen to this podcast then to check and call you out on it. But because I've been writing about stuff like, I don't know, spatial audio, surround sound stuff, metaverse and albums in the virtual worlds, or even AI turning albums into like sleep soundtracks. And there's all kinds of stuff going on around the format. But is there anything that you two are excited about seeing what might be next for the album as a format?
Sure. I mean, we had a little chat about this, Megan and I, earlier. It's so difficult to predict the future. And if we could, we'd certainly be very wealthy. But, because I have contacts in other industries, you know, I'm aware of things that are happening in the wider scientific milieu. So, I mean, quantum computing will change everything that humanity has ever experienced.
Wow.
And robotics will also change everything as well. So, as a fan of Kraftwerk, and they always used to joke about, we don't make the music, we just leave the studio working, and when we come back, the album is finished. I can definitely see a point where you will have robots able to make music. And how that sounds, we can't really tell, but it's kind of exciting. I mean, obviously, we've got avatars of dead artists that can perform the old hits. AI could allow robots and avatars to create new music that sounds like the old. And then in terms of, you know, the specific album and how you buy it, 3D printing is really going to change how manufacturing works. I mean, my brother is a top engineer in the car industry. And right now, the top end manufacturers can 3D print metal engine parts that were very complicated in a much cheaper way. So I can definitely see in the future that instead of buying a record, you could basically get the license for the record and make records at home yourself in a way that CDRs was the beginning. 3D printing is like something so far in advance of what we've had so far. You'll be able to make all sorts of things at home, including perhaps a vinyl album or a CD or anything that you wanted. So I think those are, whether that's in 10 years, though, I think all these things in the end are about economies of scale. You know, billionaires might be able to make them. When will you or I be able to make them? I mean, who knows? The technology is in process of being created. So fun to think about it, though.
Well, when you say fun, that's just fried my mind. The fact that I'm going to 3D print a record player and then 3D print the record that I then put on it.
Because you could, as an artist, you could give someone all the artwork assets and let them make their own artwork, make their own cover. That's like only they own that version of the cover. That could be quite fun, like completely personalized. Well, not, or maybe not fun. Maybe we make It's weird, isn't it? That all this stuff, like, I feel like we're at a moment of, like you say, it's not just about changes in the music industry and the tech that we use. It's the stuff all around it that could just throw everything up in the air again. Robotics, 3D printing.
Yeah. But it's still, at least we'll be listening to an album while this stuff is going on.
I think ironically the album is one thing that will survive.
Yeah.
How we listen to it may change.
Yeah.
Last question from us, which was, tell us an album that you're currently loving, new or old, doesn't matter. Look, see, everyone, see, this is what I love about specialists in their subject. And I can see in your eyes, particularly, I thought I saw it in Jonathan's eyes, but he's now holding up some albums. But I thought you had that. I thought you had that option paralysis of looking around and going, "Oh, we've got thousands of records. I don't know. I've listened to loads too much." What have you got there, Jonathan?
As a Nick Cave fan since The Boys Next Door, I think Wild God, his latest album, is perhaps his best of all time. It's certainly, I think, one of the best of the year. And as an artist, never count an old man out. You can still be creative at any age. And, the tragedy that he's had in his life has really turned that pain into something incredibly evocative and powerful. And then on our own label, the album is a remarkable record, definitely the best since Dusk. And I think it's great that there's so much great new music. So many people are always telling me about great new records. And when you hear them, they are great. So I do think word of mouth continues to be a huge point of discovery.
Very much. Megan?
Yeah, I always hate these questions because my brain just suddenly starts swirling around at a million miles an hour. But a band I've been listening to a lot recently is Sunday 1994. They're like a really nice, shoegazy, dreamy 90s inspired duo. And with a really interesting mix of one of them being from LA and one of them being from Slough. So how you marry those two locations together to create such a great body of work, to me, is actually really, really interesting, because you've got the quite grittiness of Slough versus this whole, kind of lovely, dreamy world of LA and sunshine. And it brings a nice amount of misery alongside kind of hopefulness. So I've been listening to them a lot, and I would recommend it.
That's the Twin Peaks of the shoegaze movement, though, isn't it?
Exactly.
Oxford, Slough, Reading, all around there. I went to a festival once in Slough where Ride and Slow Dive and all those bands played back in the original days of shoegaze. So maybe that's it. And then you've got these slightly, as you say, more dreamy American side to it. It's perfect. Absolutely perfect. It's been brilliant talking to you. Thank you very much. We wish you all the best with this year's National Album Day, and you'll have to come back and tell us a bit more about how it went and what you've got ready for next year, if you see what I mean. But thank you very much for talking to us. You take care.
Thank you.
Jonathan Green and Megan Page talking all things albums. What did you take away from that, Stuart, apart from robots making music? That bit at the end, the futuristic picture that Jonathan was painting, did honestly boiled my brain. But apart from that, some interesting insights into what the album is and why it's successful and why we still like it.
Yeah, this is why I ask my nerd question every time. You never know what we're going to get, but normally it's robots. Do you know what I liked? The thing that stuck out to me was when Megan was talking about who's buying records and who's buying albums. And this idea that don't assume that the younger generation have binned off albums for good and binned off buying music. But actually, I think a lot of sort of your traditional record buying bores of our age they can kind of be down on the kids and say, right, they're just all watching TikTok, they don't care. But actually, a lot of this resurgence, the fact that so much of it comes from teenagers, that's really interesting to me. It kind of gives me kind of the future is kind of a bit more positive. This idea of buying music.
it's interesting just to back up what they were saying. And it's a while back, but I was in a second-hand record shop in Sheffield, which was full of old vinyl. I'd say this is going back a few years now, but apparently it's success. And then the shop had virtually stopped stocking CDs at the time, but vinyl albums flying off the shelves because, as according to the fellow who ran the shop, because it was all the students, because the shop was quite near one of Sheffield's universities, and he said students are coming in all the time, and they're looking for big old albums or curios, but everyone, he said, that year had turned up with a portable record player, and now they needed something to play on it. So it's interesting. Well, we hope you enjoyed that episode. I say thank you very much once again to Jonathan and Megan, and thank you for listening. Do subscribe if you can in your podcast app to us, and give us a review and a rating to help us spread the word. Also, if you have any questions of your own which you'd like answered on the show, you can email us at thepriceofmusicpodcast@gmail.com. And finally, if you would like to support the show with some spare change, we now have a Patreon page where it works out. If you want to sign up to be a fan or super fan, I think you can sign up for as little as £2 a month, which is works out across the year. That would come to a total of about 4 London-priced pints of beer. And are we not worth a small round of drinks? Just go to patreon.com/thepriceofmusic to find out more. Thanks again, everybody. Cheerio.